I'm really excited about today's topic, which is very hopeful about the next year for all of us who work in campaigns and advocacy, trying to move the issues we care about. And it's how to make 2019 your winningest year yet. And as I introduce our guest, Charles Kelley, I told Charles that how busy I am and what a busy week I'm having, and he reminded me that in his world, state legislatures are in session and things are really crazy. So I'm even more grateful to Charles than I was already that he's joining us today. At McGuireWoods, he works as the VP of Digital to help service McGuireWoods' clients who range from state capital groups doing work in state capitals as well as federally. He has experience in both digital and political worlds. He actually had his own digital agency before coming to McGuireWoods, and also has worked on the advocacy side of things at nonprofits, several campaigns, and even as legislative staff. So we're really excited to have him. So Charles, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm excited to chat through this today. And before we do, a couple of small housekeeping items that I should have mentioned before to folks who are on the line. One is we'll keep this pretty tight. We try to keep these to 30 minutes because, like Charles, we know how busy all of you are working to move your issues. So if you have to jump off at any time, no problem. We will be sending everyone a link to this webinar recording in short order. But at the end also, if you have any questions, ping us and we will try to get to those. So today, we're going to focus on a few things as we think about how to make this everyone's winningest year yet. The first thing that we're going to think about is how to use personalization to move issues, gather supporters, and win. And the second thing we're going to talk about is how to. So if you're generating supporters, new supporters, you really need to figure out ways to scale contact with those folks. Third, we're going to talk about how to be smart about content. And then fourth, we're going to talk about how to break down silos within your group. So let's start with personalization. So I'm being a little funny here when I say it's time to get personal, but Charles, something that you told me when we started talking about this, and I said, why is personalization now so important? You said, it's really nothing new. It's always been important. Share with me what you mean by that.
Sure. And like you said, the reality of it is that personalization is nothing new. It's been around for years, if not decades. It's just kind of taken on a new aura. It's now hypercharged with all the amount of data that, we can collect and we can utilize. So you're seeing more personalized content now because we have much more data to work with to actually target those folks. I think you're also seeing an emphasis on personalized content now as well because in light of recent events of the past year, most folks have become just so speculative of all online content and anything that's not really tailored to a user just kind of seems like, generally seems like spam these days and is disregarded as such as well.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And you also have said that you think that people just aren't really paying attention anymore.
Sure, yeah. And in addition to paying more attention in specific areas, they're just generally paying less attention overall. I know most of you have seen the rise of clickbait headlines and folks just commenting and not reading articles and that sort of a thing. Generally, folks are, have a shorter attention span to content online these days. So the content that engages the user right off the bat is more likely to capture their attention. And then, the way it goes is that content is much more likely to drive them to take action with your content. So getting a user kind of invested in your content is really your number one goal. And one of the best ways to do that, the way I think of it is kind of what's better, just a general call to action to your entire membership to quote unquote write your legislator, or through the data that you've collected, saying, we know you're in the city of Richmond, Virginia, not to be specific, that's where I'm located. You know, as a resident of the city of Richmond, this issue should mean a lot to you. Please write Delegate X and tell them that you support this issue. All that based on the data that you're collecting on the back end. So making that content much more personalized to the user based on the data that you have already at your fingertips.
Yeah, sure. We always talk about, people talk about the ABCs of sales, always be closing, but I always tell people, our customers, there's an ABCs of data too, and it's always be collecting to inform those next touches with your audience. And another thing that you've said is that you think users are listening, and that interested me because it wasn't a thing that I'd really thought of when I first started talking with you about personalization.
Sure, and I think that there's kind of two avenues there. I hit on one a little earlier. With today's privacy concerns, breaking through that noise and having a more organic voice to your content these days is a must. Corporate speak and lingo don't really play well when you're trying to get folks to engage. You need to break down that barrier, and I think personalization, again, is a great way to break through that barrier and have your content be a little bit more organic. A few other ways to do that, try a few different voices on. It's always great to have the, head of your organization come out and, say, please activate on XYZ issue. But sometimes that's not the best. Sometimes folks don't respond well to that. I know Edelman does the trust barometer every year, and they kind of rank what messenger folks are most trusted. Heads organizations generally rank towards the bottom of that list. So finding a community leader, a business leader in their area, an expert on the topic always ranks high on that list as well. So finding someone a little more well-versed or more specific to the message you're trying to put out works well from what I've seen. Also, test those different voices. Don't just stick with one. Again, different folks respond to different voices. Some may be more apt to take action if it is a message from a CEO versus others if it's a message from, their local board of supervisors member or something like that. So just try to test it out. And like you said, ABC, always be collecting on the back end. Track how those users are responding to different messages. And at some point in the future, perhaps you can do different messages to different universes from different messengers to capitalize, in the most efficient way possible. And again, like I mentioned, today, kind of online advocacy specifically is getting more and more scrutinized by users. So really anything that you can do to kind of give your content an edge and again, rise above that noise is worth doing.
Yeah, so this is really, I think, pretty borne out by some statistics. And one that I love is that I think there's this fear that personalization is going to weird your audience out. But actually, I think it's actually something your audience has come to expect. Like 3/4 of people are angry when brands don't recognize them. And, over 40% of people actually surveyed have said they're willing to give up personal data for more personalized marketing. I love, there's some interesting research on how, like, I don't remember the stat, but some huge number of people, when they turn off ad choices or turn off, clear their cookies or sort of bump up or beef up the privacy and security on their browsers, often, like, some huge percentage of them go back to being served those ads and turn all of it back on a few days later, because people actually really want personalized content. So not sort of shying away from talking to them based on the things about them, I think is super important. I think that what you're saying makes a lot of sense. You want to create content that acknowledges your audience's individual person is really important. And I think another thing that's really important is what channel they're consuming content on is just as important as their views see this in your work a lot too. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing like a massive, lift of some kind of psychometric analysis where you're, the sort of like latte drinking Volvo driver to to reach your audience. It's things like where do they most often convert when they see this content? What issues do they say they're interested in? What kinds of things do they care about in their community? So doing that certainly I think is super super important. So obviously that's all easier and said and done than done, even if you have kind of committed to personalization. I think a thing that gets a lot of people a little nervous about it is kind of how to scale that content. And really what I mean by this is if we're talking about buying into personalization, how do you commit and then execute to personalize contact at scale in a way that's manageable? So, whether that's on the tactics or tools side or something else. So, we have really seen a boom in the use of technology that facilitates this kind of personalized contact at scale, but people sometimes have trouble wrapping their hands around it. So something that you said to me, you actually just wrote me an email at some point when we were talking about this, and you just wrote data, 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 which I love and would love for you to talk more about.
Sure, and it's pretty direct and to the point. I mean, the more data you have, simply the more data you have to work with. It doesn't, like you said, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have a huge, massive voter or consumer file to work with. But at every point, touch point with that individual, you should try to be collecting as much data as possible. Again, it doesn't mean that you need to utilize all that data, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it lets you tailor more specifically your messaging to that individual, whether or not you even want to reach that individual, if it jives with your messaging and your outreach at that point in time. But at any given point, you should just be collecting the most amount of data that you possibly can.
You without putting you on the spot, what are there a couple of data points that you just find consistently useful over and over again across the different kinds of work you're doing for your clients?
I think basic demographic information help. We've seen that kind of the older generations are more apt to take action, and I'm sure everybody on the call right now has seen that. The 45 and up crowd is far more likely to take action and a little less speculative of content that asks them to give up certain types of data, address, phone number, that sort of a thing, than younger generations are. Younger generations really try to engage in more kind of direct advocacy, patch through phone calls, that sort of a thing. But so basic demographic information, I think, goes a long way. And that's pretty general and it's pretty easy to get a hold of as well. I think the other things that kind of drive what we do specifically is finding out, and again, we'll probably talk about this in a little bit, is finding out what issues matter the most to them. And I think you actually mentioned that, Lucy. And that, again, kind of helps drive your messaging. If a person isn't interested in engaging on an issue, but you're reaching out to them to engage on that issue, it just really doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think, those few things, and I think, again, the demographic information is stuff that folks are going to be collecting anyways, is one. And I think, trying to find out what that user is interested in is a must.
Sure. So things like vote history or demographic data that might indicate how likely they are to engage. Yeah. Maybe not so much like Home and Garden magazine 15 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's a good point too. In addition to the demographic information, I mean, a lot of what we do and our targeting is obviously based on voter data. I mean, that's publicly available. It tells you a lot about a person, and there's a lot of data that you can then append to it. So I think voter history is kind of, when I say demographic information, that's kind of wrapped up in there as well. But whatever publicly available information you can get your hands on is gonna allow you to more personalize that communication.
Totally. You've also said ask the right questions, and I take that to mean kind of exactly what you've been talking about, figuring out what those other data points are that are going to be indicative for you of how to activate those folks.
Sure. Yeah. And again, like I said, not everyone in your organization is going to want to activate on the same thing. Not everyone in your organization is joining for the same reason. So up front, when that person comes in and you onboard them, I think that's the proper time to quote unquote ask the right questions. That allows you to kind of drill down the data thereafter, asking them why they joined, what they're willing to do for your organization. Do they want, I come from the campaign world, so it's, the first question asked is, do you want to put a sign in your yard? Do you want a T-shirt? Do you want to volunteer on the campaign? That sort of a thing. Or, what they want out of your organization. What issues are they interested in? What do they think your organization should be doing for them? So I think, again, collecting some of that survey data, let's call it, on the front end kind of helps you drill down your data thereafter to more specifically reach some individuals.
Sure. So something I really appreciated when you were talking to me about this in the lead up is that you gave some really specific tips, and I'm hoping that you might just run us through those a little bit.
Sure, and I'll try to keep it brief. So first, use merge fields. I know it might seem like a no-brainer, but it's worth mentioning. I think we all probably dabble a little bit in using the first name and the last name personalization in a to field in your email tool, or listing, addressing a person by first name when you start an email. That's sort of some basic merge fields that everyone, I think, should be doing. It helps you personalize that email a little bit more. It helps you avoid spam filters and that sort of a thing. But based on the data merge field, like I said, if you're collecting a lot of data up front, specifically, for us, calls to action and having collected voter data, we know who that person's legislator is based on the address we have on file. We know what their legislative district is, that sort of a thing. So if you're doing a call to action, more specifically, merge that call to action and say, like I mentioned before, please write Delegate or Senator X and tell them that you support this bill. Mention their city name. You've got their address data perhaps in there already. So just utilize the data that you have on hand to better personalize that communication. That being said, don't overdo it. You don't have to merge every single data field that you have as you are writing these messages. The easy answer is sometimes you don't need to use all the data. You don't need to list the person's full data set on every single email, but you need to do, again, what makes sense for your communications without overdoing it. So I think, that kind of sums up point number one, and use them as advanced as you can get with the data that you have. Second, ads are a must. We can write all the emails in the world, but average open rate on an email is anywhere from 20 to 30%. So you're only reaching a small minority of your target audience. Not everyone's going to read an email. The way to amplify that and to get it on another platform, another venue, is to utilize online advertising. Again, it reaches the user on multiple platforms. It makes sure that they're seeing your content where they're otherwise not seeing it if they don't open up that email or anything like that. Generally, when compared with traditional types of media, it's an easy and cost-effective way to kind of repurpose those email lists into audiences on social media and then advertise against them, again, in the most cost-effective way. So whether you're remarketing to your existing universe or reaching out to a new universe, making your ads relevant, like we've talked about, as relevant as you can get within your ad creative, and as personalized as possible to your audiences, is really, again, just a must. And last but certainly not least, don't sleep on texting. Like I mentioned, emails have about a 20 to 30% open rate. Texting has virtually 100% open rate, a little bit less than that technically. But folks are going to read your text. Key there is obviously much like a tweet. Keep it short, keep it sweet, keep it outside of the text message to kind of flesh out your call to action or whatever you're reaching out to them for. Again, it's not for all cases. It's got use cases, but it is a cheap, a quick, an easy, and an effective way to reach your users for those really important updates that you want to have them see, and for those calls to action that are really going to matter to your organization. So again, it's not for every effort, but definitely don't sleep on it.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen a lot of success among people like that. I mean, it makes sense when you think about how much time people are spending on their mobile devices every day. I mean, on the email front, people are reading about 2/3 of their email on mobile. But you're right, text is so much more effective than email, and email was the best we had for a long time, certainly much more effective than direct mail. So to get eyes on it, unless you're trying to activate little old ladies in Pasadena. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it is certainly much more effective. We've built a tool called Telegraph, which facilitates peer-to-peer texting, and it is just a great opportunity to facilitate that one-to-one contact with customers, and as you say, far and away the most effective outreach mechanism. And you can, again, going back to our earlier theme, use things like merge tags and beyond to make that truly personalized. So we're big fans of texting over here. So finally, I think we've put some of the kind of like the buy-in on the personalization piece, and then kind of how to think about scale on the contacting piece. And so the last piece of that is content, I think, because if you have great personalization and great tools and tactics, but your content sucks, you're not really going to be in luck. So I want to talk about content as we kind of wrap this up. One of the things that I think about content is a lot is really thinking about how to truly know your audience. And I know that you said this, as you're thinking about your data set, what does that mean to really know your audience? How do people know if they know them enough?
Sure. Yeah. And again, I think what it boils down to is really analyzing your data set, trying to look at the data that you have and try to identify some trends there, and then trying to write content that's tailored to the majority of those users, or if you're sectioning out your data and only trying to reach out to different subsets, even all of your users, or the audience that you're communicating with. So really trying to identify those trends and then tailoring your content to what you're seeing in those trends. Case in point is if you're sending to an audience, probably don't want to fill it with GIFs and make a bunch of pop culture references and that sort of thing, because it's just stuff that they're not going to get. There are certain times and places for that, and that's really not one of them. So really just know your audience, I think, and analyze your audience before you reach out to them.
Yeah, and presumably, you've shared with me some of the ways you test and tweak your content, and presumably that's a big part of that cycle of getting to know them.
Sure. Yeah. Again, just utilize all the tools that you have and utilize them to your fullest. On your email platform, use A/B testing. Again, use merge fields. I can't stress that enough. Test different messages and see what works with your audience. Test different voices and see what works with your audience. On Facebook, if you're running advertisements, tweak your ads. Use dynamic ads to see what creatives work best for certain audiences. Again, some messages are just going to resonate better than others do. But not testing those messages beforehand and then kind of moving forward with the highest performing ones means that you're not going to run the most cost-effective campaign you could be. And I know a lot of the folks on the phone are with smaller advocacy organizations with probably smaller digital ad budgets. And in that case, if you're not testing, if you're not making your campaigns more efficient. It means that you're, one, throwing away important funds to your organization, but two, you're also leaving some advocates on the table.
Yeah, for sure. I think that a challenge that organizations large and small have is, how to message to different segments of their audience. I've encountered this a lot with large nonprofits, where in this kind of fractured political climate, they have, for instance, like a wealthy donor base that might be part of, like supporters of the Republican administration, and then they have supporters who are grassroots supporters who might be like, Women's March, left-wing activists, on issues that are crossover, like a health issue or something like that. And I've had a lot of customers in that sector say like, well, they feel totally different about this issues, this thing, and they're really activated by this language. So I'm going to send them these disparate messages, which can be effective, but you do have to make sure you're not faking it with any segment of your audience, because, in this day and age, if you try to do that, someone is going to see the other email you wrote or they're going to find out. I see this a lot with groups that are, working on controversial issues like, say, environmental issues or hot button social issues. It's obviously important as you do this segmenting and start to build content funnels to folks that you're still serving messages that you'd be willing for anyone in a different segment of your audience to see. But that's certainly a manageable proposition, I think.
Sure.
I was thinking about sort of how to be smart about content, and we often encourage people to. You put it really well when you said, give them something to do.
Sure. I think what I was saying there is basically, just regularly updating your audience on what your organization is doing is great. It has its place with some organizations, trying to, update them and keep them apprised of what your organization is doing and the value add it brings to them. But for some more of the campaign and kind of call to action type efforts, it's not really moving the needle. So giving your audience something to do, whether that is, reading an article or writing a legislator or signing a petition, even taking a survey so you can gather more data, just giving them something. They have an opinion. They want to know that opinion matters to you and your organization, and really just providing them an outlet to express that opinion in some way, shape, or form, I think is important.
Yeah, and you've also said send thank you notes, and that I think is a really important reminder to people.
Yeah, again, I think that that one may sound like a no-brainer as well, but people love to be thanked for doing something, and especially when they're doing something as important as taking action on an issue that is of utter importance to your organization. Two kind of real quick methods of that are obviously a landing page after they take action. That lets you, depending on your advocacy tool and ad setup, you can kind of more accurately track successful actions. And then that in tandem with kind of action-based thank you emails after they take an action with your organization, allow you to, one, kind of personalize a little bit more, but it also lets you cover all your bases after they take action. On both those methods, you should be asking them to share it on social media. You should be asking them to forward the action that they took to a friend and ask them to take action. So you should be capitalizing on that person's action even after they have taken it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think it gets down to that last bullet of really thinking about playing the long game, that you aren't just like, in some cases you may be, but in the vast majority of cases, the hand idea is when you should work to continue. One way to give someone something to do is to engage them, as you say, with landing pages. But I think we obviously help our customers with all the time. Tools like our tool Advocate that connects folks directly to lawmakers are a really good example of something that you can give someone to do where they also feel empowered by you. Instead of just telling them that the sky is falling, you're saying, help me. You're so critical to helping this lawmaker or decision maker do the right thing on this issue. And it is just statistically true that audiences who engage with you that way are not only more likely to give you their contact information for that exchange, but also they have skin in the game, and they are just statistically more likely to take other kinds of action for you later, whether it's donating, volunteering, depending on what kind of group you're a part of, or doing some other kind of action. So as we start to wind down here, I just want to talk about, as you bring all of this together, how to break down these silos. And you gave me a few good tips, and I loved the first one, which was make a list, check it twice.
Sure. And actually check it way more than twice. But keeping track of your members and your advocates and everyone that is touching your organization, and moving them to engage across multiple platforms and venues, and just generally keeping track of what they're doing on those platforms is really a must. So even with online actions, but also with offline actions, having kind of a full service solution that you can keep track of all your user data, their activity, and even reach back out to them via email or with an advocacy tool is a must. Also scoring your advocates, so keeping track of what they're doing and how often they're doing it, and then assigning a score to that is also a great way to utilize that data, an easy way to do it, so you can down the road know who to reach out to more quickly, and to allow them to take action when it's really, really urgently needed, when you have a committee vote, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. but p.m. So doing that, obviously the most effective way to do that is kind of with an all-in-one solution that's got a database, a email solution, a texting solution, an advocacy solution. I'd be remiss, since it's a Crowdskout conference call, to tongue-in-cheek mention that Crowdskout's a great tool for that. We utilize it, and I know a bunch of the folks on the call do as well. And it's really been a game changer in kind of how we manage, utilize, and reach back out to our data set.
That's awesome. That's awesome. We appreciate that. Well, I think that the way you've framed this out, the way you've talked about looking at your audience as a whole, figuring out how to sync up what's happening offline with what's happening online, and then also promoting your champions, I think is a really great kind of way to sort of wrap this up, and some of those tips on how to break down those silos.
Sure. And again, taking your offline advocates online is important. It's an easier way for them to reach out to their legislators, to the decision makers that are really going to matter and move the needle on your organization's agenda. So the more that you can get all of your offline advocates online in some way, shape, or form, the better. I think the best example I've got, I was at a conference a few months back, and I think AARP's head of advocacy was there, and she was kind of detailing how they do it, which is a great setup. Obviously, AARP, national organization, have state chapters, that sort of a thing, but they kind of empower their administration at the local level by teaching them and training them on digital, and just having them have a general knowledge of how to set up a Facebook account, how to set up a Twitter account, all of AARP's online platforms that folks can utilize, and that sort of a thing. And then those local leaders go and make cheerleaders out of their local members. So it was a great way to do it. And that sort of stuff. They will help set advocates up on social media if they don't have it already, and kind of keep them updated on ways that they can take action online. So moving those folks that are kind of traditionally offline advocates online, in addition to them still sending in letters to the editor and making phone calls and all that good stuff, is only going to amplify your message that much more. Also, once you've got those cheerleaders, you've got those folks, like you mentioned, who are really invested in your calls, promote them. Keeping track and analyzing your data those folks should be pretty easily identifiable. They've taken action across a multitude of platforms. Reach out to those folks directly, reach out to them personally, thank them, and promote them on your social media channels, on your email platform, anything, everything. The more that they feel like a VIP, the more engaged in your organization. In addition to that, even if they're not taking actions, perhaps set up some sort of an Advocate of the Month award or a joint member profiles, that sort of a thing. Again, everyone loves to see their name in lights, and your advocates are really no different.
Yeah, that's awesome. That makes a lot of sense. I'm always interested in all the kind of interesting gamification that folks are doing. To promote their volunteers on the campaign side, or giving people badges, interesting sort of plays like that. I'm amazed by how much people of all ages and all backgrounds love participating in that. We're all competitive at heart. So to recap what we've talked about today, I think there are a couple of things. One, I think you successfully convinced everyone that personalization is super key. Two, reaching a wide base of supporters doesn't have to be totally unmanageable. Mutually supporters and learning more about others on the data side, and your ability to do all of that really is reliant upon being able to connect, whether through native tools or API integrations, whatever, the disparate outreach that you do, so that, as you say, when you're looking at someone online, you also know whether they received a piece of mail in their mailbox last week or what's happening in their community, having that holistic view of someone both online and offline. So before we wrap this up, I want to just ask you a couple of questions. Someone on the webinar actually shot us a few questions about the kinds of customers we work with and whether we work with corporate customers. Yes, we have a lot of customers who engage with us, who are working on the public affairs side of the corporate world, just like a lot of Charles's customers. And we got a couple of questions about pricing. I'm going to have our marketing manager just reach back out to you directly. But Charles, I wanted to ask you, after sort of someone commits to this, obviously there are flashpoints where that a campaign has been successful, like a bill that you're trying to stop doesn't get passed, or vice versa, a big part of your organization's policy agenda makes it. But in general, in times where you don't have those kinds of easy metrics, or even maybe when you're on the losing side, despite your best efforts, how do you know if you're being successful?
Sure, and I think keeping track of that data, again, it kind of helps you see growth patterns, and I think growth is always something to look for there. Growth in all your efforts. Again, like you mentioned, sometimes you're not going to win them all, and you're also, there may not be a clear and decisive victory, but I think continuing your course of action is a must, especially with regards to outreach and data collection. Be an issue that your user base needs to advocate on. But I think continuing to, one, manage that data, and two, reach out to that data set is key. I think it shows value to your users and your organizational members if you're an organization. And I think that is also a good way to kind of judge it if there's no real flashpoint, or you're on the losing side of a battle that you weren't going to win just solely through digital advocacy. Is poll your user base. A lot of the folks on the phone, again, are organizations, so poll them, ask them what they thought of the campaigns that you have run digitally and whether they thought it was effective, because really the buy-in needs to come from your user base as to whether or not they fund it or utilize it or even see it as a value add versus winning your issue at the end of the day.
That makes sense. That's interesting. So final question, and before I ask it, thank you so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate it, and we really appreciate awesome customers like you. And so I'll leave you with this. Do you have any predictions, Charles, for the coming couple of years, both on the political cycle side or legislative? It's sort of what kind of any outreach plays that you see interesting, innovative groups pioneering that you think we'll see pop up more?
No, I mean, I think the kind of overall theme of today's webinar was personalization, and I think if anything, you're going to see that hyper personalization as we move forward. I know in light of recent events, again, you would think that folks are going to collect less data and it's going to be utilized less often. I think that's probably going to die down over the next year or two, and it's definitely going to ramp back up and probably be more utilized than it was before. Again, I think as you've seen in the past year or so, the folks that are collecting that data are going to be more transparent about their collection of that data and what it's utilized for and that sort of a thing. So I think that is one way that the game is going to change, if you will. But I think, again, you're just going to see more of this personalization and data collection, not necessarily less.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to revisit this with you in 2020 and see what your vantage point is then. Well, Charles, thank you so much for taking the time today. Thank you to everyone who was on the call. As a reminder, this will be available on demand on our website, and also we'll shoot it out via email.